Hello and welcome to Knitter Matters. This is episode 38. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you're watching live or the replay. I really appreciate you being here, so thank you. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant. My company is Style Matters International, and throughout my life I've been an avid sewer and knitter. And many years ago I was the proud owner of a lovely yarn shop in Brighton, England. And one of the great pleasures of owning a yarn store is that you get to be able to teach people how to knit. And it's a great joy all these years later to be teaching you how to knit, albeit in a different platform. Do feel free to ask any questions as we go along. I won't be able to answer the questions because I can't see them while I'm doing the Facebook Live. If your name pops up, I might be able to see that and I'll give you a shout out. No, I can see Peggy Ann, hello, and Jill. So nice for you to join us. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So I'm going to ask the camera to turn to the table and then we'll get started on today's topic, which is brioche. So I want to ask you first of all, have you noticed how many knitting references there are for food or food related? We talk about cakes of yarn. These are yarn donuts when they're like this. And then, of course, the wonderful brioche, which this is brioche knitting. Now, we're going to take our time a bit today because all we're concentrating on is how to knit brioche. So if you want to grab your needles and knit along with me, we've got a few moments because I'm just going to talk for a few moments. So feel free to grab your needles if you wish to. Now, it's an unusual name, brioche, for a piece of knitting, even if we do have these cakes and donuts. But there's several theories on how this particular technique got its name, and possibly the most likely one is from Nancy Marchant. She's an expert in brioche knitting, and she discovered the technique when she moved to the Netherlands in the 1970s. And her research indicates that brioche referred to a type of cushion, a type of pillow made by English ladies in the 1800s. And the pillows were named after the light and fluffy French baked goods. And the puffy knitted fabric created by the knitting technique took on the name. And I can see why. Look how lofty and puffy this fabric is. It's wonderful. It's the same on both sides. So it's a reversible fabric, pretty much. It's a double layer fabric, certainly, and it's very warm. So it's fabulous for slouchy, relaxed sweaters, which are better off being a little loose-fitting rather than too tight because of just that heat insulation. Ideal for hats, shawls, headbands, cowls, scarves, etc. I've got a sample here of two-colour brioche. It's not a very good sample. It was my first attempt at brioche, a two-colour brioche. But you can see quite clearly, this is actually done in the round rather than flat. And you can see quite clearly the reverse side here. It does look a little different when you do it in two colours, but you can really see how that double layer of fabric there. It's a little harder to see just in one colour, but you can really see that. But you get a lovely, stretchy, squishy, delicious fabric. So I'm not surprised. It's kind of almost food-related terms. Now, sometimes brioche knitting is called shaker knitting. It's also called English rib. It's sometimes called fisherman's rib. Now, strictly speaking, fisherman's rib is not brioche. The finished look is the same. The result is the same pretty much, but the technique is different. Now, as is often the case in knitting, there are several ways to knit brioche. But the key elements of any brioche knitting are the slipped stitches and the yarn overs. That's really simple to do, but it's how you work those that create the stitch pattern. So we're going to look at how to knit basic one colour brioche on flat straight needles. So when you see the term flat knitting, that means it's knitted on straight needles, it's not in the round. Now I would suggest that when you knit brioche, you actually use smaller needles than the ball band states. Now obviously if you're following a pattern, be guided by that. But when I made up this headband, the ball band said to use US 9, which are 5.5mm needles, for this number 4 weight yarn. I actually used US size 7 4.5mm needles. I went down 2 sizes and I've still got a really lovely lush fabric. And as to what yarn to use, this is an acrylic blend because I loved the colour. But avoid anything too slick and slippery. So avoid anything like a sort of silky rayon or silk itself. Anything too slick is going to be really hard to work with, especially to start with as a beginner. And if you're finding it tricky to control your tension or it's too stretchy, try an untreated wool yarn because it kind of sticks to itself. In a minute I'm going to cast on and I'm going to use wool. This is so superwash yarn is treated. So this is just an untreated wool. It's very nice. It's just a plain worsted wool. And the thing is with wool, it kind of sticks to itself. It's a bit like your own hair, you know, that it has scales. So when wool is treated, those scales are sort of, it's like when you put conditioner on your hair, it smooths down the scales so they don't lift. But you actually want them to do a bit of that when you're knitting certain things, and brioche is one of them, because you want kind of to grab onto each other. That's why wool, if you wash it too hot or put it in too hot a temperature, it felts, because those scales lift and then the whole thing mats together. So a bit of useless information there, but maybe that'll help you remember why not to wash wool too hot. Anyway, there's a variety of different ways to knit brioche. There's as many ways to knit brioche as there is other stitches. Oh, Joyce Rasmussen, thank you for joining us. That's lovely. Welcome. So, some start with an odd number of stitches, some start with an even number of stitches, but they all start with a setup row after you cast on. Now, when it comes to casting on, you need to cast it on loosely because it's such a stretchy fabric. So I tend to cast on with a larger needle. Hi, Debbie. Nice for you to join us. Thanks so much. So I tend to cast on with a larger needle and then revert to a size or two smaller. If you don't have a larger needle, you can always cast on using 2 little needles, 2 smaller needles, like that. I don't find that particularly easy to do, but if that's what you have to hand, then you can do that. So it's a way of doing it. And then you just revert to the needle size that you're going to use. But you don't want to cast on too tight, whatever cast on you use. So I'm just going to cast on some stitches now. And I'm going to cast on 12 stitches. I'm going to do a long tail method of casting on. Again, use a stretchy type of cast on. So I'm going to use a long tail cast on and cast on 12 stitches. And I'm not going to pull that too tight. I'm going to sort of keep my finger there to make sure I don't pull it too tight. So let me move that out the way so it's not in shot. So I've got to count my stitches. So I'm doing a long tail and I'm keeping it fairly relaxed. I'm just doing it very slowly so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, how about 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now I want to make sure I've got 12 stitches and not 13 or 11 because that's going to really upset my knitting otherwise. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. I've got 12 stitches. Now I'm going to start my knitting. I'm going to go back to my smaller needle. This is... On this, I'm using this yarn suggested a 4.5mm needle, which is a US 7. I've gone down to a 4mm, which I'm guessing is a US 6. Sorry, I'm still in millimeters, everybody. Okay, so now we're going to do our setup row. And our setup row is a bit weird. So we're going to take plenty of time on this and I'll do it several times. So we do a yarn over and we slip 1 purlwise. In brioche knitting, unless your pattern says otherwise, we nearly always slip purlwise. But we do this, we're slipping this and doing the yarn over at the same time. But I'm not doing a yarn over, I'm not taking this off the needle at the moment. Well, I am actually. But what I'm doing, I keep the yarn at the back sorry, I'm keeping the yarn at the front here. Then I do my yarn over like that. Now I'm going to do this several times so you're going to see. I've got to bring this forward to slip it, my yarn over like that. And you'll see with the yarn over, it's kind of resting over the top of the stitch. That's important. Yarn over, knit stitch, yarn over, slip, knit stitch, yarn over, slipped, knit stitch, slip stitch, yarn over. Okay, you only do that setup row once. So what we did there, you'll see as we go along, that first slip stitch, you're doing the yarn over at the same time. But when we do these yarn overs, it's resting sort of, it's like a shawl wrapped around the shoulders of the next stitch. Okay, so now I'm going to do my next row. Let's change my needle size so I'm not knitting with two different sizes. Now we do, I'm slipping that, I'm going to do a yarn over, I slip that, my yarn over, now I'm doing my yarn over, but I'm also knitting the two stitches that I did in the row before. So it's that knitted stitch plus it's yarn over. I bring my yarn forward, I'm slipping that purl stitch, I'm knitting the yarn over and the knit stitch from the previous row. Okay, bringing my yarn forward, slipping my purl stitch, keeping the yarn where it is at the front, wrapping round for my yarn over, which is resting, sitting on the top of that stitch. Slip the purl, yarn over, and let it sit on top of the stitch. An ordinary yarn over, if you remember, is sort of like that because you want to create a hole. We don't want a hole, but if I was doing a regular yarn over, I'd be doing that, or I'd resting it over, then knit the stitch. We do not want a hole. We're slipping, I'm knitting the stitch and the yarn over from the previous row, and I'm making another yarn over. Slipping that, and my last stitch is a yarn over and a knit stitch. Okay, I'm going to keep going. We're taking our time today because it takes a few rows for the pattern to form. Now, the beauty of this is that you only have to remember that one row now. You did the setup row. All we have to keep doing, slip, yarn over, knit the stitch and the yarn over from the previous row, yarn forward, slip, purlwise, knit the yarn over and the stitch from the previous row, slip, purlwise, knit, yarn over and stitch from the previous row, slip, purlwise. I'm making my yarn over and I'm knitting the stitches from the previous row. I'm keep doing it slowly. We can be slow today. And then again, knit my yarn over and stitch from the previous row. We're going to keep going. That's all we have to do. Now, as I said before, there are as many ways. This first slip and yarn over, sometimes I find myself even just looking at what I'm doing because it seems odd to do a yarn over right at the start, but we do. We slip it, we do the yarn over at the same time. And again, we're just going to do the same thing as we did before. It's important that that yarn over wraps, kind of goes over the shoulders of the stitch. And again, it seems odd that we're doing almost a yarn over at that last stitch, but we are, and it's fine, works well. There are some methods of brioche where you do an uneven number and you do an edge stitch either side, and that's fine too. If that's what your pattern needs you to do, then do it. But for this one, this is just the easiest way to get you started with brioche. So I've got that slipped purl stitch, knitting, yarn over, which goes over the shoulders of the stitches below. Slip the purl, knit my wrapped stitch. Well, I won't say wrap, that's a different stitch. My yarn over in the stitch from the row before. Okay, purl, knit with my yarn over, wrapping over from the yarn over the row below, the previous row I should say. And you keep doing that. You'll see very soon that our brioche is starting to form. You can see just there it's starting to form. I probably could have gone down a needle size on this one, but no matter. And because I like it to be fairly kind of squished up. And you will get into a rhythm with this once you get the hang of it. I would also tell you that there's certain terminology for some of these brioche terms, and your pattern do take time. If you're looking at doing a brioche pattern, do take time to look and familiarize yourself with the terminology, because there are things like a BRK, which is a brioche knit, and a BRP, which is a brioche purl. Oh, Anne and Gwen. Anne, thank you for joining us. Gwen, lovely to see you too. That's wonderful. I love brioche. It's just one of those lovely, relaxing things to do. And it's so satisfying. Even two-colour brioche, which takes a bit more concentration, certainly to get started, because you have to do slightly different things with the different colours. But again, we'll do that another time. But I want to get you familiar with brioche knitting, because so many people have said they want to be able to do it, and it does look intimidating, but it's really not. Another thing to be aware of with brioche knitting, and if you've just joined us, what I'm doing here is I'm slipping purlwise. Again, unless it states otherwise, you nearly always slip purlwise. And then your yarn over and the knit stitch, you're knitting the yarn over and the stitch from the previous row. But you're doing another yarn over on this row, and it sits sort of on top of the needle. It wraps the shoulders of the stitch. Another thing to remember with brioche is that it takes up a lot more yarn. Remember, you're doing a double-sided fabric, essentially. It takes a lot more yarn than ordinary stocking stitch, or in fact ordinary rib. So just be prepared for that. Okay. There we go. And what else was I going to say here? I said about the pattern terminology. Oh yes, you're effectively doing every 2 rows makes 1 row, if that makes sense. So what you're doing, each row, you're only completing half the stitches, because of course you're slipping some of them. So, and the row that you're slipping, you're really, I'm knitting this stitch now, but I'm slipping this one. So it takes you 2 rows of knitting to create one full row. And if you recall, a few weeks ago we did double knitting, which has similarities to this technique, because you're creating a double-sided fabric in one go. The difference with this as to the double knitting is that in double knitting we created sort of a hollow fabric, almost like a tube. This we're not. We're just creating a sort of double layered fabric. And you can see here now, you see why I said just stay with me, because it takes a few rows for the pattern to start forming. You can see really quite clearly now how these nice ribs really stand out. I really like the effect of brioche. Okay, I'll do another row and then I'll just talk about the headband that I made. And then I will actually show you how to bind off as well. So, yeah, I nearly went into ordinary rib then. Okay. So as you can see, whichever side you look at this, you've got this really nice squishy fabric. And it's as if by magic, you do the first few rows and it looks a complete mess. and then it all starts to kind of sit and fall into place. Yeah, I could have cast, actually I made quite a loose cast on there. Better to have a loose cast on than a tight one. Always much better to do that. You can always do something with the cast on. But you can see how those nice ribs, those sort of pronounced ribs come up. Now, the other thing I like, particularly with this even number of stitches of cast on, if you're doing a piece of flat knitting, I actually like the edges. Let me show you here how nice the edges are on this headband. You know, they almost sort of roll round. You know, we haven't got a lumpy edge stitch. You can, if you like an edge stitch or you need to put one on because your tension is a bit all over the place, you can do one. But, you know, then you've got to add an extra stitch and that could throw your knitting out. But either way, you can certainly do that. But I really quite like the edge. For something like this, it's really, really nice. It's sort of seamless, as it were. And to do this headband, I really just noodled about with this. I cast on 18 stitches. I did about 18 inches of brioche knitting. And then I bound off. Then I did this little loop. I cast on 8 stitches for that. I knitted about 4.5 inches in brioche. And then what I did, obviously I cast off the ends. But here, when I cast off, I ran a gathering thread through both the cast on and the bound off edge, just to pull that up a little because I wanted to get this into this smaller loop. I wrapped the loop round and then I seamed my loop there. And you know, if your bound off is a bit messy or whatever, it's not going to show because you've got this loop going over the top. So it's super easy to make a headband or something like that. Let me show you now how to do a bind off. Again, there are several ways to do, there are almost as many ways to do a bind off in brioche as there are to do the cast-ons or the stitches themselves. But for this purpose, it's a simple bind off. And again, follow what your pattern says. If you're following a pattern, do what it says there. So I'm just going to purl the pearls. Remember, you need to treat these stitches, the yarn over that's over the top of the stitch below, treat that as a pair. They're not separate stitches, otherwise you will get a hole and you'll get a very loose cast off, and an ugly one at that. So we're going to just knit those two together and we're going to do a standard cast off, bind off, whichever you like to call it. Purl. So essentially we're purling the pearls. I'm still keeping it fairly loose because I want it stretchy. But the yarn over and the stitch get knitted together and passed over. Dorothy, hi, thanks for joining us. So nice of you to do that. And if you've missed most of today, that's fine. You can watch us on the replay. It'll be uploaded to the page afterwards. So I'm really just doing a bind off here. Again, if your pattern may say otherwise, depending what you're doing, but if you're just doing this headband, you can do it this way. Still want to keep it stretchy, don't make it too tight. So you can give it a little pull as you go along, just to check. And if you've done it too tight, you can just sort of tink back. And I wouldn't recommend, until you're familiar with how brioche sits on your needles, I wouldn't recommend, if you have to unpick, I would do it stitch by stitch. It's tricky picking up brioche if you rip out loads and loads of rows. You tend to lose the yarn overs. It can be done, but I would just do it, be patient and do it stitch by stitch if you need to, until you're really familiar and comfortable with it. So that's a really easy bind off. Depends if it's going to show, you might want to do a different one, but this will suffice for a lot of things, especially if they're going to be encased in a seam or something like that later. There we go. So that's a basic, easy brioche bind off. I've still got some stretch in that, which is what I want. There you go. Okay. So that is the wonderful brioche. I'm going to ask the camera to come back to me now. That's the lovely, lovely brioche, and I hope you enjoy knitting it. I think it's almost one of those things you can sit and do, and It's so relaxing. It's very rhythmic after a while, and it's you won't want to stop doing it. I can assure you, it's lovely. So I do hope you enjoy that. If you have any questions about brioche, put them in the thread below during the week at any time, and I'll be happy to answer them. Lou, hi! Thank you for joining us. So, don't forget, Mary Maxim, if you go to, you get a 20% discount, and Pat has joined us, thank you. There's a 20% discount of one item from Mary Maxim online, from their website. It's the highest priced item in your cart, but you must use the promo code Cheryl at checkout. So 20% off one item if you use the promo code Cheryl at checkout. And do also take a look, while you're there, take a look at the Mary Maxim site. There's lots of fun, really interesting little Christmas projects and holiday projects to make, whether you're a knitter, crocheter or a sewer. So, as always, this episode and all other episodes of Knitter Matters are uploaded to the page afterwards. You'll find them under the section that says videos. And they're also on our YouTube channel of the same name, Knitter Matters. They're there, so you can watch them at any time if you need to. Help us reach more knitters. We're on Instagram as well. So subscribe to us on YouTube, like us, follow us, whatever we have to do on all these various social media platforms. Don't hesitate and ask any questions. Knitter Matters is all about helping knitters. So if you have any questions or want more information or want us to cover a subject in the future, then please let me know. So until next week, stay well, stay safe, stay calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.